Opening hook? Still awake? Yeah. Some nights the ritual doesn't work. That's all right. I keep thinking about something Churchill said during the worst stretch of the war, May 1940. France was falling, America wasn't coming, and everyone in his cabinet wanted to negotiate with Hitler. The weight of an entire civilization on his shoulders, and he couldn't sleep either. But here's what's interesting. The decision that saved Britain. He didn't make it in some dramatic war room moment. He made it at 3 in the morning, alone in his study, when everything felt impossible. There's something in that for all of us carrying weight tonight. Sometimes the answer isn't in the solving. It's in the sitting with it. Let me tell you about that night, and what happened when one man decided to stop fighting the darkness and just be present with it. The weight of May 1940. Picture London, May 1940. Not the London of victory parades or defiant speeches. The London of blackout curtains and empty streets. The London where Churchill paced his study at number 10, cigar cold between his fingers, reading telegram after telegram of retreat. The German war machine had done something no one thought possible. In just 6 weeks, they'd swept through Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Holland. Now France was crumbling, the British Expeditionary Force was trapped at Dunkirk, and in Washington Roosevelt was making sympathetic noises but sending no ships. Churchill had been Prime Minister for exactly 18 days. 18 days to inherit a war that was already lost. His cabinet was fracturing. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, was quietly exploring peace terms through Italian intermediaries. We could get reasonable terms now, Halifax argued in their morning meetings. But if we wait, if we let them invade. The unspoken truth hung in every conversation. Britain was alone, completely, utterly alone. And Churchill was a man who'd made spectacular mistakes before. The Dardanelles disaster in 1915 had nearly ended his career. He'd been wrong about the gold standard, wrong about Indian independence, wrong about so many things that his own party had kept him out of power for a decade. Now, when being wrong meant the end of everything, the decision was his alone. I think about that weight sometimes. Not the grand historical weight, we know how the story ends, but the personal weight, the 3 a.m. weight of a man who knows that if he's wrong, if he's misjudged this moment, then everything his civilization built over 1,000 years dies with him. That's the weight that kept him awake. The sleepless hours. May 26, 1940. Churchill's war room was a basement maze beneath Whitehall, but he wasn't there. He was in his private study, still in yesterday's clothes, surrounded by maps that told the same story from every angle. Defeat. The reports kept coming. General Gaut's forces were cut off. The French were asking for an armistice. German panzer divisions were racing toward ports that Britain needed to survive. Each piece of paper on his desk was another reason to negotiate, another argument for Halifax's position. The rational choice was clear: save what could be saved. Live to fight another day. Accept that sometimes you lose, and losing with honor is better than losing everything. But Churchill couldn't sleep, not because he was fighting the decision, because something deeper was at work. He'd dismissed his secretary hours ago. No more meetings tonight, no more advisors with their careful arguments. Just him, the weight, and the silence of a city holding its breath. And in that silence, he stopped trying to solve it. This is what I find remarkable about that night. Churchill didn't pace the room, making lists of pros and cons. He didn't call Roosevelt again or draft another telegram to the Dominions. He sat in his leather chair, cigar finally dead, and just sat with the enormity of it. There's something profound in that moment. The most consequential decision of the 20th century, and it wasn't made through analysis or strategy sessions. It was made in the space between thoughts, in the stillness that comes when you stop fighting what you already know. The moment of knowing. Around 3 a.m., Churchill did something that surprised even him. He opened a book. Not a military history or strategic analysis, a volume of poetry. Tennyson, actually. Ulysses. The poem about an aging king who chooses one last voyage into the unknown rather than settling for the safety of his throne. Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. He read those lines again and again. That which we are, we are. Not what we were when the empire spanned the globe, not what we might become if we played it safe. What we are right now, in this moment when everything is stripped away except the choice itself. And sitting there, reading poetry, while his nation faced extinction, Churchill felt something shift, not a flash of inspiration or a surge of confidence, something quieter, a settling, a recognition. The decision had already been made, not by his rational mind weighing options, but by something deeper, something that had been there all along, waiting for him to stop arguing with it. Britain would fight, alone if necessary. Not because victory was certain, it wasn't. Not because the odds were good, they were terrible. But because that's who they were when everything else was stripped away. That which we are, we are. I've been thinking about that phrase a lot lately. In the middle of the night, when the problems feel too big and the resources too small, when every rational analysis points toward retreat, sometimes the answer isn't in the thinking, it's in the recognition of what's already there. And the cabinet meeting. The next morning, May 27th, Halifax pushed harder. The Italian ambassador had sent signals. Terms could be discussed, reasonable terms given the circumstances. We could save the empire, Halifax argued. The fleet, the dominions, most of our forces. If we negotiate now, from a position of some strength. Churchill listened. He understood the logic. In pure strategic terms, Halifax wasn't wrong, but something had changed in those sleepless hours. Not Churchill's analysis of the situation, the facts were still the facts. What had changed was his relationship to uncertainty. I have thought carefully in these last days of whether it was part of my duty to consider entering into negotiations with that man, Churchill told the cabinet. He never used Hitler's name if he could avoid it. But I am convinced that every man of you would rise up and tear me down from my place if I were for one moment to contemplate parley or surrender. If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. Halifax stared at him. Winston, you cannot be serious. The cost, Churchill interrupted, is not the question. The question is who we choose to be when the cost is everything. That afternoon he addressed the full cabinet, not just the war cabinet, but all 25 ministers. He spoke for a few minutes about the military situation, the chances, the risks. Then he stopped. I am convinced, he said, that every one of you would rise up and tear me down from my place if I were for one moment to contemplate parley or surrender. The room was silent for a moment. Then someone started clapping, then another. Within seconds, the entire cabinet was on their feet, not because Churchill had convinced them with arguments, because he'd given them permission to be who they already were. Had the deeper choice. Here's what strikes me about that moment. Churchill didn't win that room with rhetoric or strategy. He won it by making a choice that was deeper than tactics. He chose to trust something that couldn't be quantified. The accumulated weight of 1,000 years of muddling through. The stubborn refusal to be reasonable when reasonableness meant surrender. The willingness to fail spectacularly rather than succeed safely. In business terms, it was insane. The probability of success was close to zero. The downside was total destruction. Any rational analysis would have said, take the deal, preserve what you can, live to fight another day. But Churchill had learned something in those sleepless hours. Some decisions can't be made by analysis. Some choices have to be made by recognition of what you are when everything else is stripped away. I think about this when I'm staring at the ceiling, running numbers that don't add up. Scenarios that all point toward the sensible choice. The choice that preserves resources, minimizes risk, keeps options open. Sometimes the sensible choice is right. But sometimes there's something deeper calling, something that says, this is who we are when it matters. Not who we were when things were easy, or who we might become if we play it safe. Who we are right now, in this moment, when the choice defines everything. Hacked. The longest days. What followed were the longest days in British history. The evacuation from Dunkirk, 338,000 men pulled off the beaches by an improvised fleet of destroyers and fishing boats. France fell on June 22nd. By July, German bombers were over London every night. Churchill still couldn't sleep most nights. The weight hadn't lifted. If anything, it had grown heavier. Every decision now carried the knowledge that he'd chosen the hard path, the uncertain path, the path that might lead to complete destruction. But something had changed in his relationship to that weight. He wasn't fighting it anymore. He'd made his peace with uncertainty. On July 20th, Hitler offered Britain one last chance for peace. Reasonable terms. No occupation of the British Isles. The empire could remain intact. All Britain had to do was recognize German control of Europe. Churchill didn't even dignify it with a formal response. He had the BBC broadcast a single sentence. The British Empire and the French Republic, linked together in their cause and in their need, will defend to the death their native soil. That night, he wrote in his diary, "I sleep better now. Not because the problems are smaller, but because I know who we are in the dark." That knowledge is worth more than all the strategic analysis in the world. The space between thoughts. I keep coming back to that moment in his study, 3 a.m., May 26th, when Churchill stopped trying to solve the unsolvable and just sat with it. There's something there that goes beyond wartime leadership, something about the space between thoughts, the place where decisions make themselves if you stop arguing with them. How many times have you known the answer before you knew it? Felt the pull of a direction that didn't make sense on paper but made perfect sense in your bones? The rational mind wants to analyze, compare, optimize. It wants to find the path with the highest probability of success and the lowest risk of catastrophe. And most of the time, that's exactly what you should do. But sometimes there's a deeper knowing, a recognition of what you are when everything else is stripped away. And that recognition doesn't come through analysis, it comes through stillness, through the willingness to sit with uncertainty until it reveals what's been there all along. Churchill found that stillness at 3 a.m., reading poetry while his world collapsed. Not because he was avoiding the problem, but because he'd finally stopped fighting it long enough to hear what it was trying to tell him. The weight we carry. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if Churchill had chosen differently. If he'd been reasonable, practical, strategic, if he'd taken Halifax's advice and negotiated while Britain still had some leverage. Would the world be different? Almost certainly. Would more lives have been saved in the short term? Probably. Was his choice the rational one, given the information available at the time? Honestly? No, it wasn't rational. It was something else entirely. It was the choice to trust something deeper than analysis, to bet everything on the accumulated weight of who they were when who they were was all they had left. And here's what I find remarkable. It worked. Not because Churchill was smarter than Halifax, or because he had better information. It worked because sometimes the irrational choice is the only one that honors what you actually are. I think about this when I'm carrying weight that doesn't fit into neat categories. The decision that keeps you awake, not because it's complex, but because it's simple. So simple, it's terrifying. The choice between who you've been and who you might become. Between the safe path that preserves what you have and the uncertain path that honors what you are. Those aren't business decisions. They're recognition moments. Moments when you stop analyzing and start listening to something that's been there all along, waiting for you to get quiet enough to hear it. The practice of presence. Churchill developed a ritual during those dark months of 1940. Every night, after the last meeting and the final telegram, he would sit in his study for an hour. Not working, not planning, not solving, just sitting. "I don't think during that hour," he wrote to his wife Clementine, "I just am. With whatever weight the day has brought, I've found that if I fight the weight, it grows heavier. If I sit with it, it becomes simply what it is. Weight. Nothing more, nothing less." His secretary once asked him what he thought about during those hours. "Nothing," Churchill replied. "Everything, the space between thoughts where decisions live before we think them." There's something profound in that practice. Not meditation, exactly. Not prayer, though it might have been close. Just the willingness to be present with whatever is true right now without trying to fix it or escape it or optimize it. How often do we do that? How often do we stop trying to solve the problem long enough to just be with it? Most of the time, we're either fighting what is or planning what might be. We're rarely just here, present with the actual weight of this actual moment without needing it to be different. But sometimes, in that presence, something shifts. Not because we've solved anything, but because we've stopped arguing with reality long enough to hear what it's actually saying. Had the courage to not know. By September 1940, London was burning every night. The Blitz had begun. German bombers came in waves, turning entire neighborhoods into rubble. The death toll mounted. The pressure to negotiate grew stronger. Churchill still didn't know if Britain would survive. The Americans were still neutral. The Russians were allied with Hitler. The Commonwealth was loyal but distant. Every night brought new damage, new losses, new reasons to doubt. But he'd learned something valuable in those sleepless May nights. He'd learned the difference between not knowing and not trusting. Not knowing was simply the condition of leadership. You never have all the information. You never know how it ends. You make the best choice you can with what you have and then live with the consequences. Not trusting was different. Not trusting was the refusal to act on what you know in your bones because it can't be proven on paper. "I don't know if we'll win," Churchill told his private secretary during one particularly brutal night of bombing, "but I know who we are, and I trust that more than I trust any strategic analysis." That distinction between not knowing and not trusting might be one of the most important things he learned. You can act decisively without knowing the outcome. You can commit fully without guaranteeing success. You can trust what you are even when you don't know what you'll become. The long view. The war lasted 5 more years. There were moments when it looked hopeless and moments when victory seemed certain. Churchill made brilliant decisions and terrible ones. He saved Western civilization and made choices that cost thousands of lives. But that night in May 1940, that moment when he stopped fighting the uncertainty and started trusting something deeper, that remained the foundation everything else was built on. Years later, when historians asked him how he knew to fight on when all logic said surrender, Churchill would reference that sleepless night. "I didn't know we would win," he said. "I knew we would remain ourselves. In the end, that was enough." I think about that phrase when I'm in the space between what was and what might be. When the old way isn't working anymore, but the new way isn't clear yet. When the only choice is between who you've been and who you might become. We would remain ourselves. Not the self that needs everything to work out. Not the self that requires guarantees. But the self that can sit with uncertainty and still choose from a place of recognition rather than fear. Hat. What remains? Churchill died in 1965, 25 years after that sleepless night in May. In his final years, he often spoke about that moment as the most important of his life. Not because of what happened after, but because of what happened during. "I learned that night," he said, "that you can't think your way to the deepest choices. You can only recognize them, and recognition requires stillness." The problems he faced that night, the weight, the uncertainty, the choice between safety and truth, those didn't go away when Britain won the war. They just took different forms, new challenges, new weights, new moments requiring recognition rather than analysis. But he'd learned something that carried him through all of it. He'd learned to trust the space between thoughts, to sit with what is without immediately trying to change it, to let decisions emerge from stillness rather than forcing them through strategy. That's what remains from that story, I think. Not the specific choice Churchill made, but the way he made it. The willingness to stop solving long enough to listen, to trust what emerges from presence rather than what emerges from planning. The problems you're carrying tonight, they're not Churchill's problems. The weight is different, the stakes are different, the choices are different. But the process might be the same. Stop fighting it long enough to sit with it. Stop analyzing it long enough to feel it. Stop trying to know how it ends long enough to recognize what it's asking of you right now. Hand. The practice of recognition. So what does this look like practically? How do you sit with uncertainty without drowning in it? How do you trust what you can't prove? Churchill's practice was simple. Every night, an hour of presence. Not thinking about the problems, just being with them. Feeling their actual weight instead of the weight of his resistance to them. "The problems," he wrote, "are never as heavy as our fight against them. When I stop fighting, I can carry almost anything." Some nights he read poetry. Some nights he stared at the fire. Some nights he just sat in the dark, cigar cold between his fingers, feeling the actual texture of uncertainty instead of the story he was telling himself about uncertainty. And gradually, over time, he learned to distinguish between the voice of fear and the voice of recognition. Fear was urgent. demanding, full of worst-case scenarios and immediate solutions. Recognition was quieter, slower, more like remembering than deciding. You probably know the difference. Fear feels like pressure in your chest, like time running out, like if you don't solve this right now, everything will collapse. Recognition feels like coming home, like remembering something you already knew but had forgotten. Fear says, figure it out, fix it, control it, optimize it. Recognition says, this is what's true right now. This is who you are in this moment. This is what the situation is asking of you, not what you wish it was asking, not what would be easier or safer or more strategic. What it's actually asking right now of who you actually are. The wisdom of not knowing. There's a Zen saying, not knowing is most intimate. Churchill probably never heard it, but he lived it during those dark months of 1940. Not knowing is most intimate because it strips away everything except what's actually here. All the plans and projections and strategic analyses. Those are stories about the future. Not knowing brings you back to this moment, this choice, this wait. And in that intimacy with what is, something becomes possible that's never possible when you're trying to control what might be. You can respond instead of react. You can choose from who you are instead of from who you think you should be. I don't know if this helps. I don't know if Churchill's story connects to whatever weight you're carrying tonight. But I know this. The problems will still be there tomorrow. They always are. The question isn't whether you can solve them all tonight. The question is whether you can be present with them, whether you can sit with the uncertainty long enough to hear what it's actually saying instead of what you're afraid it might be saying. Sometimes the answer that emerges from that stillness is the one you expected. Sometimes it's completely different. Sometimes there's no answer at all, just the recognition that you can carry this weight, whatever it is, because that's who you are when everything else is stripped away. The space to breathe. Churchill kept that practice for the rest of his life. An hour each night of what he called sitting with what is. Not trying to change it or escape it or optimize it, just being present with whatever weight the day had brought. His secretary once asked him if he ever got bored during those hours. Bored? Churchill laughed. With reality? How could anyone be bored with what's actually happening? The stories we tell ourselves about what's happening, those can be boring. But what's actually happening is always alive. What's actually happening is always alive. I think about that when I'm caught in the loop of worst-case scenarios and strategic planning. When I'm so busy thinking about what might go wrong that I forget to notice what's actually going right, or what's actually just here. The breath going in and out, the weight of your body in the chair, the sound of night settling around you, the fact that you're here, now, carrying whatever you're carrying with a strength you probably don't even recognize. What's actually happening right now? Not the story about what might happen or should happen or used to happen. What's actually here, in this moment, requiring nothing from you except the willingness to notice it. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes just noticing what's actually here, instead of fighting what might be coming, creates the space you need to breathe. To recognize, to choose from a place of presence instead of a place of pressure. The courage of ordinary moments. Churchill saved Western civilization, but he did it one sleepless night at a time. One moment of choosing presence over pressure. One decision to trust what he recognized instead of what he could prove. Most of us aren't facing the collapse of civilization, but we're all facing the collapse of something. The way things used to work, the person we used to be, the certainty we used to have about what comes next. And in those moments of collapse, the same choice is available. Fight the uncertainty until it becomes unbearable, or sit with it until it reveals what it's been trying to teach you. The courage Churchill showed wasn't the courage of grand gestures or inspiring speeches. It was the courage of ordinary moments. The courage to sit with not knowing, to trust what couldn't be proven, to choose from recognition rather than from fear. That courage is available to you tonight. Not because your problems are the same as Churchill's, but because the process is the same. The willingness to stop fighting what is long enough to hear what it's asking of you. You don't have to save civilization, you just have to be present with whatever you're facing right now, without needing it to be different than it is. That's enough. That's always been enough. Coming home to what is. As the night deepens and this story settles, I want to leave you with something Churchill wrote in his diary on May 28, 1940. 2 days after that sleepless night when he stopped fighting and started recognizing. I have learned, he wrote, that coming home to what is requires no journey. You are always already there. The question is whether you're willing to stop running long enough to notice. You are always already there, in the place where decisions make themselves, in the space where you know what you know before you know it, in the stillness where recognition lives. The weight you're carrying, the choice you're facing, the uncertainty you're sitting with, it's all already here. You don't have to go anywhere to find the answer. You just have to stop moving long enough to hear what's been there all along. Maybe you drift off before this ends. Maybe you just rest your eyes and let the weight settle where it wants to settle. Maybe you sit with whatever's true right now without trying to change it. All of that is enough. You've done enough today. You've carried enough today. Whatever's still spinning in your mind can wait until tomorrow. The problems will be there in the morning. They always are. But you'll meet them differently after rest. Not because rest solves anything, but because rest reminds you who you are when you're not fighting what is. Hat. Closing. Churchill lived another 25 years after that night in May 1940. He had victories and defeats, moments of clarity and periods of doubt, but he never forgot what he learned in that hour of stillness when everything hung in the balance. The deepest choices, he said near the end of his life, are made in the space between thoughts. Everything else is just paperwork. The space between thoughts, where you are right now, if you're willing to notice, where recognition lives, where the answer has been waiting all along for you to stop asking the question. Sleep well or just rest. Either way, you've carried enough today. That's always been enough. I'll be here tomorrow night if you need this again. Same time, same space between thoughts. Rest easy.